Hello, I'm Marcus Louth, and welcome to the Anomaly Project, The Breakdown, the show where we look back at our most recent episode and explore some of the details mentioned that we didn't get a chance to look at the time. Now, myself and Steve Mera recently spoke with paranormal researcher and lecturer Barry Fitzgerald, and it was a fascinating conversation that I highly recommend that you check out in full. Now, one of the most interesting things to come up during our chat with Barry was the importance of diet in terms of paranormal communication, particularly how the levels of iron in the body can determine whether this communication even takes place. Before we move on, let's remind ourselves of Barry speaking about this.
You know, there's a common weakness within the phenomena we find, especially with symptoms such as that became known today as the old hag attack, or the incubus and succubus from the medieval period. We keep pushing that back right into Babylon, and you find these references to these particular creatures. And what we discovered is that a lot of the times, 9 times out of 10, they tend to attack females more so than males. And that's because of the iron count within their systems. Iron is their weakness. And they will wait until the female enter their monthly cycle and they become anemic. That's when they strike. And even in psychiatry, it's known that low iron levels will allow phenomena to manifest within their patients. So again, we're looking at a weakness within our iron, and how this is manipulated by the phenomena to get what they want. And so it's up to us to take this back and say, okay, what are we consuming? What are we eating and drinking that's having an effect on us? And understanding who we are, what this meat suit needs, and that's very important. Now, for a long time, the phenomena stopped its interaction. I thought it was like, oh, I must have annoyed it some way, and that was that, until I discovered that no, my iron levels were too high, and through blood work, and so that was corrected, and what do you know, it starts to happen again. So they stayed away, and partially because of that is because of oxidization. The elements that they're using to manifest is directly affected by oxidization between the ultraviolet and the iron. So that causes an issue. That does not happen when you go underground. Once you rob the UV from the atmosphere, then that's a different kettle of fish. And but I tend to stay away nowadays.
Now, we will come back to iron and why this might prevent communication with these paranormal entities or the phenomenon very shortly. First, though, we will turn our attention to a well-known phrase to describe the elites, particularly the nobility and royal houses of Europe, blue bloods. Now, this term has its origins in medieval Europe. It was believed that those of noble lineage had veins that appeared blue due to their fair skin, which allowed the underlying blue-coloured veins to be more visible. This visual characteristic also became associated with the privileged class, hence these royals and elite families of Europe were referred to by the rest of society as blue bloods. Now, while we are straying into pure speculative territory, could it be that this term originates from something much more physical or real, and that goes back much further than medieval Europe, perhaps to a time when the gods themselves walked the earth? Okay, so stay with me here. Now, we know that human blood is red, and this is because of the iron content in the hemoglobin in the red blood cells. When this hemoglobin binds with oxygen, it forms oxyhemoglobin, which has a bright red colour. Why then is it said that those of noble or royal standing have blue blood? Is it just a phrase used by the many to differentiate themselves from their rulers? Or could there be something more scientific to this? Now, if we return to ancient times, we can find that the so-called right to rule was something reserved for the gods or for their direct descendants. And we should remember, at least according to some interpretations of the creation stories, these gods arrived here long ago from the heavens, something that many people have taken to mean that they were extraterrestrial and from elsewhere. We should also note that many of these legends, such as those from ancient Egypt or the Indus Valley, were referred to at the times as historical fact. Now, whether they were extraterrestrial in nature or perhaps survivors of an ancient civilization all but wiped out, primitive humans would have viewed these advanced figures as gods, and as such, these gods ruled over humanity for thousands of years. Suddenly, however, they began retreating from public view, installing in their place puppet kings and queens, with legends stating that these first puppet kings were demigods, essentially human, alien or god hybrids, and from these alleged hybrid puppet kings over thousands of years came the royal houses and nobility that was spread throughout Europe, eventually even transplanting themselves into the new world of America with the Pilgrims. So, speculatively thinking, if these royal houses and nobility had ascendants who were hybrids, part human and part god or extraterrestrial, could it be that these extraterrestrials had literal blue blood? Now, while we looked at the reason that human blood, much like many other animals on the planet, is red due to the iron content within it, we also know that there are animals on Earth that do indeed have blue blood. This is ultimately due to their blood containing copper as opposed to iron. Such animals as cuttlefish, crabs and octopuses all have blue blood. Of further interest, there are some researchers who offer that octopuses, one of those blue-blooded creatures, very well might not have originated here on Earth, but could well have found itself in our oceans after piggybacking a cosmic ride on the back of a meteor that splashed down into the water thousands, perhaps millions of years ago. And it's perhaps also interesting to note that some legends and creation stories refer to the gods not only as coming from another world, but of coming from an aquatic one. Now, with all of this in mind, we might contemplate that the gods, whatever they were, came from a planet or realm of existence that had an abundance of copper, and in the same way that Earth has an abundance of iron. And if this was the case, we might imagine that life on that potential planet would have blood based on copper instead of iron, blood that would essentially be blue in colour. It is also interesting to note that many of the Hindu gods are depicted as having a blue pale appearance, while the colour blue is associated closely with the gods of ancient Egypt. Okay, so if we assume for a moment that these copper blood-based entities did arrive on Earth in antiquity and become the gods of the ancient world, they would then need to find ways to replace the copper in their bodies, similar to how humans replenish iron in their bodies by eating iron-rich foods. These copper-based entities, however, would find iron toxic, and moreover, once it entered the bloodstream, it would aggressively begin to replace the copper in the blood. Once more, we might recall the notion that iron repels these strange paranormal entities and prevents communication. Could the reason be because these entities are somehow copper-based? Now here it is worth mentioning that some researchers, perhaps most notably Andrew Skylarov, have suggested that around the same time that the gods supposedly began their rule over humanity, humans went from a hunter-gatherer existence, one consisting of meat, fruit and berries, all foods rich in iron, to one of agriculture, of wheat and grain. Now, it is a widely accepted view that this occurred as part of human development and progress and ultimately allowed for civilization and for life to become easier for humanity in general. However, given that wheat and grain are not iron rich, we might ask if this switch to agriculture was one forced upon humanity by the gods so as to lead to an abundance in foodstuffs that were much more suitable for their copper-based requirements. Moreover, it is worth asking, when this switch to agriculture took place, why humans didn't cultivate iron-rich root vegetables and fruits, which would, incidentally, have likely resulted in much higher yields, as opposed to the copper-rich grains and wheat. Although agriculture did indeed lead to the large cities of the ancient world, rather than making life easier for human beings, at least initially, quite the opposite can be said. It is also worth noting the findings of James Scott from Yale University, who pointed out that, again, at least initially, this change to agriculture led to a reduction in the average life expectancy. And this could very well be connected to a sudden copper-heavy diet instead of one rich in iron. Now, if there is any validity to these claims, was this a purposeful decision to weaken humanity for reasons we can only guess at, not least for control? Or might it have been one taken purely out of self-serving reasons of the gods, with any effects on humanity being purely incidental? It is perhaps also interesting to note that copper has many antibacterial properties. Even today, people use copper cups, tankards and plates due to these properties and the alleged beneficial effects of the human body. Could it be that the gods, whoever they might have been, also knew this? And could it have been this and the gods' ability to replenish the copper in their bodies while keeping iron as low as possible that led to the apparent exceptionally long lives of the gods, some of whom, according to ancient king lists, lived for hundreds and even thousands of years. If we take the ancient Egyptian records, for example, we can see that only 7 gods ruled over ancient Egypt over the course of 12,300 years, with the first of these ruling for 9,000 years, and the remaining 6 reigning for an average of 550 years. However, what is also clear is that over time, these reigns, and so you might assume lifespans, grew steadily less, until by the time of the apparent hybrids or demigods, these reigns were barely over 100 years. Of course, we know that reigns continued to decrease to ones that much more reflected that of a typical human lifespan that we know today. Could this be another clue that the gods, over time, were finding it increasingly difficult to exist on Earth? Okay, so stay with me. Iron is one of the key elements in aiding in the body expelling carbon dioxide, and as such, a copper-based entity, which we, for the sake of argument here, we will assume that the gods were, would have struggled to do. And if the body was unable to expel enough carbon dioxide, it would have a huge detrimental effect on the body, leading to high blood acidity, which can lead to all manner of illness and disease. Now, in an attempt to combat this, the body would use minerals from within itself, including joints, bones, and teeth, to neutralize this carbon dioxide buildup. However, this would result in another wave of potential illnesses and conditions, including weakened bones and joints, as well as eventually damaging the kidneys and ultimately causing further ill health. Now, returning to the ancient king lists, could this reaction to the iron in the body have resulted in the lifespans of the gods decreasing dramatically? And could this be the reason not only for the gods retreating to their own realm of existence, wherever that might be, and even of interbreeding and creating hybrid puppet kings to rule in their name? Now, all of this is wild speculation, there is no doubt about that. It is, though, intriguing speculation nonetheless. One more thing to consider here: if paranormal entities are adverse to iron, or put another way, if the phenomenon is adverse to iron, then does that mean they or it is somehow connected to the gods of antiquity? It is certainly food for thought. Now, another intriguing part of our conversation with Barry Fitzgerald was electromagnetic energies and regions and how they are very much a part of the paranormal world. Let's remind ourselves of those conversations.
Understand what they do, and it's very different. Yes, the phenomena goes hand in hand with that. In fact, we tend to see the industrial complex also go hand in hand with the phenomena. You see, when you start looking at the negative magnetic anomalies, you have the other side of the coin, where we tend to see, I believe it is 70% of the world's top suicide locations, or 75% of the world's top suicide locations, appear in negative anomalies. You've got this attraction to pull people to those areas. You also have these areas within there that our ancestors were using as well for sacrifice. Now, bear in mind, sacrifice was much smaller then. You had 1 or 2 people, unless, of course, you were the Mayan kingdom, which was disaster. But you have these key areas where our ancestors were sacrificing various bits and pieces, and that's another interesting key point as well. In when we're referring to the gods and everything else, this aspect that the gods weren't necessarily attracted to vegetables and fruit that were plucked from a tree. They were attracted by the sweet smell of sacrifice. That tells you all you need to know, and we really should be reevaluating those followers. But we also find that 70% of the world's top military weapons development also occurs in negative magnetic anomalies. Now, we already know, we've got paperwork here of airline companies who were also into weapons development, and the paperwork is black and white. It discloses how they were trying to make communications with aliens, and trying to develop new weapons of mass destruction and engine designs and everything else. And clearly, when I'm going through the report, I've got a red marker going, no. I'm seeing all the taglines, which really shows what they're dealing with. But because these people didn't have the experience with it, they didn't see it. So they're playing along. And another thing.
Now, these electromagnetic energies could be responsible for opening portals right here on Earth, portals that very well could lead to other realms of existence. And while that might sound like the stuff of science fiction, the fact is, scientists are studying the very real existence of such portals. Jack Scudder of the University of Iowa is just one person who has studied such portals, points in space that are referred to as X-points. These X-points are essentially where the magnetic field of Earth connects to the magnetic field of the Sun. This creates a connection between our planet and the Sun, which, remember, is 93 million miles away. Now, NASA's research has suggested that these portals open dozens of times each day and are located tens of thousands of miles from our planet, at points where the geomagnetic field meets the Sun's solar wind. The lifetime of these portals ranges from extremely small and short-lived to vast gaping gateways to a location unknown. Now, what makes all of this even more difficult, however, is that these portals or magnetic points are invisible, and moreover, they appear to be highly unstable. Now, in theory at least, if these portals exist in space around Earth's orbit, we might expect that they also exist here on Earth. And if that is true, then we might ask if these portals are allowing all manner of entities and possibly objects into our world. Are these portals in and around paranormal hotspots, the same locations incidentally, where multiple people disappear each year? While there is still much research to do in this particular area, electromagnetic energy, both positive and negative, are extremely important in understanding the paranormal world. Indeed, electromagnetic energies and hotspots is something that we will undoubtedly return to and explore in more detail in future episodes of the Anomaly Project. Now, one of the locations that myself and Steve spoke about was Mount Popocatepetl in Mexico, that has had multiple UFO reports over the years. Now, if you take a look at this one, for example, from June 2021, you can clearly see strange orb-like light emerging from the volcano and shooting off high into space. And then take a look at this footage from October 2021. Another similar orb, this time much closer to the screen, has seemingly emerged from the volcano and is flying off to a destination unknown. One final thing of interest to note here is that Mount Popocatepetl sits within a magnetic region, and as such there have been many magnetic anomalies noted in this region. And as we have just seen, there are plenty of UFO reports and sightings of strange glowing objects, both leaving and entering the volcano. Moreover, it isn't just this volcano or mountain that has increased UFO activity. Many around the world are known as similar UFO hotspots. We might imagine if these hotspots have similar magnetic anomalies, and many of which do. Mount Shasta in California, for example, or Mount Fuji in Japan are just two examples of these strange hotspots. Furthermore, many of the accounts from biblical writings take place on or near mountains. And this is something that Barry Fitzgerald also spoke about in our recent show, and I think before we sign off, it is worth reminding ourselves of that here, still today.
Well, you've got the Tales of the Iron Mountain, a place I know by the back of my hand, where you had the ancient Irish gods, the Tuatha De Danann, who came in their lofty ships and landed on the mountain in the middle of a storm. You don't land a waterborne ship and on the top of a mountain. And this was around, let me see now, that time period would have been around 1500 BC.
Wow.
when this occurred. Now this particular mountain is known for the phenomenon, and historically there have been stories of strange lights being seen, ancient worship occurring on the side of the mountain. Again, we're looking at rocks here, folks. It's about the rocks. It's about the doorways that open within the rocks, and this phenomena enters and exits. And phenomena in which, again, instead of one or two people who appear on the side of this mountain road, hundreds of people are appearing and disappearing. And that doesn't only happen in Ireland. I'm aware of another case in England where on top of a mountain pass, Hundreds of soldiers, ancient soldiers, have been witnessed tracking this particular mountain pass and heading off. And it's not just Ireland. But again, what I'm trying to stipulate here and point out is the direct connection to the rocks. That's very important to understand. And when we look at Steve's heard me mention this, it's a pet hate of mine, the Shining Ones. And when they manifest, a perfect example of that was back in the 1800s, where in France you had this young girl who a very religious young girl, and she watched this entity walk out from the cave, and she didn't know who it was. But of course, by the time the church got the hold of it, it was all manipulated and molded and fitted into a particular story. And it's the Virgin Mary that she was seeing. And next thing, these stonemasons were carving the Virgin Mary. And this young girl, Bernadette, looked at it and said, "What's that?" And they said, "Well, this is what you saw. This is the Virgin Mary." I said, "That's not what I saw." Those were her words in her diary. And whenever it comes down to it, you've got hundreds of thousands of people who end up going to Lourdes every year, worshipping at a site, trying to connect with a phenomenon that wants to be worshipped. And bearing in mind that Bernadette was afraid when she saw the phenomenon, her body was reacting. And in her words, she referred to it in her diary as that thing. Those were her words.
As always, this all gives us plenty to think about. For now though, make sure you subscribe to our channel, follow us on social media, and check out the Anomaly Project podcast.com for articles, news and updates. Until next time, goodbye and take care.